Hello and welcome to the PhD Life Raft podcast. I'm Emma Brzezinski and today I am talking to the marvellous Jamie Pei. Jamie is also known as the Messy Coach, and today we are talking about messiness and the PhD. What it might look like, what you can do with it, maybe even embrace it. So I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, Jamie.
Hello.
So lovely to have you here. As we were just saying, it's an opportunity to make a new friend, which I like very much. So I am very excited to have this chat. I'm going to talk in a little bit about messiness, one of my favourite subjects.
Yes.
And so I'm really looking forward to diving into that. But first of all, I'm going to do what we always do in terms of inviting you to say a bit about your story.
Okay. So before coming back to do my PhD, I was a journalist / writer in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, which is where I'm from. And my very last job before starting the PhD was as a features writer in a fashion magazine. I'm not going to mention names, but it was like it was one of the biggest international fashion magazine titles. So I was working in the Malaysian edition of that magazine.
Amazing.
Yeah, so it was all the glamour and the champagne lunches and the business class trips abroad and things like that. But as you can imagine, a woman's fashion magazine, I was up against a lot of perfection and beauty ideals, all of that kind of thing. And this was already something that I'd struggled with my whole life myself. Body image, the thin ideal, wanting to lose weight, all of that. So I had joined the magazine hoping to make a difference in some way and to sort of present alternative ways of thinking about beauty and different, to offer readers a different representation, I guess, of beauty. But, we were always up against very strict standards, very narrow ideals of what was acceptable or quote unquote pretty enough. So, at that point, I thought, let me go back to academia and look at this in more depth and see kind of what's really going on and how else we can conceptualize the beauty ideals. So that's how I was kind of motivated and inspired to go back to academia.
Wow.
So I had done my first 2 degrees at the University of York in English literature. And I knew that York had this wonderful little center for women's studies. And so as I was deciding to do this PhD again, I decided to go back to York again. And I got so much flack for that. Everyone was saying, why don't you try somewhere else? Why don't you get a different experience in another university? But I was very clear that I wanted to go back to the Center for Women's Studies. I got in touch with one of the lecturers who then became my supervisor, and we clicked from the start. She was amazing. We had great conversations even before I submitted my application. And I knew that this was where I wanted to be. I knew that this was exactly the kind of support that I wanted. And this was the research that I wanted to do, and that center would be able to support it. Then I applied and went back into academia. And that was in 2015. I had an amazing, wonderful, extremely fulfilling, joyful experience all through the 4 years. I loved every moment of it. I loved my supervisors, my colleagues, my whole community. I had the opportunity to do lots of things. And I was proud of the work that I did. I was really pleased with the thesis, and so were my supervisors, both of them. And then I went into my viva, and it was all the stuff of all my nightmares come true all at once in those 2 hours.
Oh no! Like, you know, I was just sitting here thinking, how brilliant! It's a good news story. I love it. It's very, very happy. Okay, all right. Okay, let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Yeah. So I kind of, I mean, it was awful. It was just so the my viva was like the day after some union strike. So I think maybe the examiners were already a little bit on edge. And it just was everything that myself and my supervisors didn't expect it to be, you know, all the elements that I was proud of and that my supervisors were impressed by and liked, the examiners didn't. And yeah, they just kind of disagreed with the way that I did the research, and they thought that it should have been done a different way and that I should have focused on different things, I guess. So that was a really messy time for me to just, it felt like, because the PhD does become quite consuming, it becomes your world, you know, it's like a little baby, it's, you know, a lot of your sense of identity gets conflated with the piece of work, that it felt like it was an attack on me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then I had to go away and revise and resubmit it, or major corrections. I mean, I know it differs from university to university. And then had to work through the corrections right in the middle of all that pandemic nonsense as well. So yeah, so it was like I was isolated, I was cut off from my partner who lived in a different town, I was all alone. Yeah, it was like there were lots of tears for about 6 months. I didn't look at it for ages, but then yeah, finally got it done, got it through, did the corrections, resubmitted it, and finally passed it. So there is a happy ending after all of that. Wow. And it turned out well in the end. So I officially graduated in 2021 in the summer. Like that would have been like the graduation ceremony. So yeah, that was a long roundabout way of saying that I feel like I've had experiences on both extremes, just extreme fulfillment and then extreme disappointment. So I feel the pains and the joys and the highs and the lows.
Yes. Well, as I say, I was getting all excited because it was sounding good, but I think it is worth knowing that that can be a difficult time in a way that you might not expect, and so it is worth. We do talk about sort of preparing for your viva, and there's I think there's emotional preparation to do as well as that intellectual preparation to do before the viva. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Yeah. So I'm really sorry that you've had that experience, but congratulations on getting it done and coming out the other end.
I will say, though, despite having had a difficult viva and despite having had to make those changes that I didn't agree with and I didn't really like the final version of the thesis, having said all that and gone through all that, I don't regret a thing that I did. And I feel that even though that last year wasn't as great, it doesn't take away from the 4 years where things were really great. So I think it's important for us to kind of make that distinction as well and not let one experience define the whole experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes absolute sense. It makes absolute sense. And I think that acknowledging that making the corrections and doing that is a job of work. Like it's that sense of you've given it to editors have got an opinion, you know. I've had journal articles like that, you kind of end up with a chapter or a journal article that didn't look quite how you thought it would look, but it's the editor had asked for these changes, you do the changes. Okay.
Yeah, and separating the work from you, like it's not a comment on you and your worth.
Absolutely.
It's just a thing that needed to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. So you said that was a messy time for you. And you talk a lot about messiness, and indeed you have called yourself now the messy coach, which I love. So tell us a little bit about how you perceive messiness now, how you work with messiness.
Okay, I love talking about this. So I'm going to check the time so I don't end up speaking for an hour, because I can go on about this for ages. Um, so, okay, like I said, I was working in a fashion magazine. This was like my immediately preceding experience from the PhD. And in, something like in media, as it were, like you're always having to make sure everything is kind of immaculate and perfect. You're meeting your deadlines exactly as is. You're right down to how you're designing the pages, right? Everything has to fit perfectly, quote unquote. And then it's exacerbated in something like a fashion magazine, where then everything has to look glossy and polished and perfect and all of that. And then I moved from that kind of world where everything's, column inches and perfect everything, into the world of research, which by nature is a messy thing, right? So I kind of conceptualize of messiness in the PhD or in research in two ways. So the first is that research itself is messy. It's this kind of beast that you can't control, you can't really predict. It's a slippery thing. Things go wrong, things turn out the way you don't expect, things get in the way. All kinds of things can happen within the course of doing the research, right? Like things don't turn out the way you're expecting. And I think that's where a lot of PhD students slip up, right? We think that it has to be perfect, and like, oh my gosh, if the research didn't turn out the way I expected it to, then I have failed. Like if it's not the perfect piece of work that I envisaged in my research proposal, then I am not a good researcher. But actually, like, the messiness is where the magic happens. Like the messiness is what makes you a good researcher, how you respond to that messiness, how you look at the messiness and find new discoveries in that uncomfortable, unpredictable space. The
messiness is where the magic happens. I've written that
down. That's my thing. I'm always saying that, like, the magic is in the mess. And I always say that if everything was known and everything was controllable and predictable, then there wouldn't be a need to do the research, right? Like you would just you would know everything already.
Well, I think also that if you kind of go, there you are, it was in my abstract, and now this is exactly what I've delivered, you kind of go, well, did you actually do any research? Like,
exactly. And how boring would that be as well, that if everything just turned out exactly as it is? And I say this because there was a lot of messiness in my research. So I was looking at women's responses and resistances to beauty ideals, and it was social research, all qualitative. And it was nothing like all the women and the participants that I interviewed all said things that I didn't expect them to. And I was like, how can this be? I don't like what they're saying. And why didn't they talk about this and this? And it was very uncomfortable for me for a long time. And I was like, oh, what do I do with this now? Like none of this data is at all like what I'd set out to find. But that led me down different paths and helped me consider different perspectives and different theories and take different approaches. And it became more interesting as a result, I think, and showed up things that I hadn't considered before and that I wasn't finding in the literature either. So that's where the magic happens, right? The discovery happens in the unexpectedness.
Yes. And I love that you're saying about it's where the magic happens, because of course messiness is also where the fear happens, isn't it?
Yes. That and there's also this really lovely saying that if you jump you can fall or you can fly, and there's that tension as well in messiness, that you feel scared to face that messiness, but that's really where that extra juicy stuff happens, where the growth happens. And so that's my first sort of working definition or conceptualization of messiness. Is the second bit of messiness is like the messiness of life, right? So all the other stuff that's happening alongside your PhD. things like health problems and relationship breakdowns, bereavements, mental health issues. And I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not qualified in that at all. But these are all things that bear on your research as well. And, we don't acknowledge those parts of us enough, I don't think. Something as simple as like moving house can completely throw the course of your research. But we feel like, no, we must, categorize them separately, like the house moving, the bereavements, the health issues have no bearing on my research. I am a robust, rigorous researcher, and I will not let anything in the rest of my life impact my work. And that's where it all breaks down, because of course it does impact on your work, right? You're a human being first before you're a researcher.
Yes.
And you need to look after the human being side of you.
Yes.
So yeah, this is what I'm all about. I'm all about, recognizing and dealing with all the other gumph and junk and all that stuff around the PhD alongside dealing with the PhD. And that stuff feels messy, right? Nobody likes to talk about things that are going on, or it feels like you're not like a good enough researcher if you're also talking about how like you broke up with your boyfriend, or like how you had a stinky date and that went really bad. But those things impact, how you're going into to do your research.
But I think a part of it, I keep saying that I'm going to do an episode on relationships in the PhD, because very often there's at least a shift in relationships when you're in the PhD, and often there are difficulties in relationships in the PhD because you're going through a transitional phase. So there will be ripples out of that, and I love that you acknowledge this sense of actually there will be changes and shifts throughout your life, and that's going to add to the messiness and lack of neat shape to your life within the PhD process.
Yeah. And I think I thought a lot about research positionality, and I did a lot of reflexive thinking within my own research, and so much of what we're going through and how we're feeling does impact on then the decisions that we make and how we're analyzing out. This is especially true, I think, for qualitative type research and social research. It might be a little bit different in STEM, and I can't speak for that at all because I have no experience in that. But yeah, I mean, I definitely found whatever was going, and perhaps as well because my research was so much around bodies and like beauty and things like that, like what was going on around in my life, and whether that's relationships or health issues or whatever, that would have a direct impact on what I then brought into the office, or when I open my Word doc.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's this sense of recognizing the mess, first of all, and acknowledging it, saying it's all part of the journey.
Yeah.
And then what are your thoughts on what to do with that then? What to do with the mess?
Yeah. So I think it's that thing where we just get super overwhelmed with the mess, and then we become one with the mess, right? And then all the mess is all kind of swirling around. You feel like you can't extricate yourself from it. A lot of overwhelm. I see this a lot among my PhD colleagues when I was still doing a PhD, and now among my clients. So I like to get curious about the mess. I think it's really kind of sitting down and first of all, letting it in, like you said, recognize the mess and then let it be okay. And then get curious about what that mess actually is. So I like to say to PhD students, like, be a researcher with whatever it is that's feeling messy and uncomfortable and that you feel like you have no control over. Like, look at it as as a bit of data, as it were, look at it and think, okay, what is actually going on here? What is it that I need to actually address here? What is it telling me? Like, maybe the messiness has something that's important that it has to tell you. So in terms of messiness in research, it could be telling you something about your data set. It could be telling you something about the methods that you're using, that maybe, the method there's something wrong with the method, or maybe there's something right about the method, or something that you hadn't considered. In terms of like your own life and what's going on, and this is not just specific to the PhD, but life in general, like if something's feeling messy, then kind of look at it and say, what is it telling me? Like, is there some sort of deeper, more embedded kind of feeling that I need to be addressing? Is there maybe some unresolved issue in my relationship that I'm not facing up to? Is there some kind of past trauma that I'm still holding on to? And, I'm not here to help you, like to tell you how to work through that. And some issues may require more qualified help, like with a therapist or with a mental health professional that will help you kind of figure out what's actually going on. But yeah, it's really kind of untangling all the different strands of what's actually going on, and then getting curious about it and seeing, what can it tell me about what's happening at the moment, and what steps do I then need to take to address each of these strands.
I love that. And this sense of because control is out often about trying to mitigate fear, isn't it? I'm going to control it, make it nice and neat.
Yes.
And actually kind of just to try and be with this. But it can be really, really difficult and very painful, isn't it? But then you can get some information from it. I love that. And I love this sense of, often I think Remainition talks about this sense of having unfinished business. That's what people come into the PhD with often. So it is, if we take that perspective, like the PhD is always going to be messy, right? There's unfinished business that you're working through, and I love it because that's the grit in the oyster, right? That's what's really gorgeous.
Yeah, I think the PhD, you're right about that for sure. Like, I think it highlights, or it brings to the fore, like certain things that are already kind of sort of bubbling away under the surface. So for example, I think a lot of PhD students are naturally quite competitive, or are quite have tendencies towards perfectionism, for example. Like, this is just an example, I'm not saying it's definitive for everyone. So they're coming into the PhD already with those kinds of issues that they've maybe been grappling with throughout their educational life or in their careers or whatever. And then the PhD kind of shines a light on that, and it feels even more messy and more uncomfortable. But that's really a good opportunity to look at it and say, okay, what is this perfectionist issue that I'm dealing with, and what are the steps that I can take to really kind of nip it in the bud now and address it.
And recognize the strengths of it. What's the strengths of what you're coming with?
Yeah.
I think it's an opportunity to get in to know yourself, isn't it? Which isn't always a pleasant experience sometimes.
Yeah.
So I always want to get to know ourselves fully. I love it. Magic in the messiness.
Magic in the mess. That's always
the new mantra. I'm aware of time, but I don't want to let you go without asking the very unfair question that I ask a lot of people about, do you have something, a top tip or something we can take away into the messiness with us?
Okay. So I wanted to say that, and I know this kind of goes against even us doing this podcast, but I was going to say that there's a lot of noise out there in the PhD and academic community telling you how you should do the PhD, how this and how that. And if you're not doing it this way, then like you're somehow wrong or you're not as good or whatever. And it can get really overwhelming, and that can feel really messy as well. So at the risk of kind of going against everything I've said, I wanted to say like the best way out of the messiness in many instances is to listen to your own instincts and your own gut and tune out any noise that is not serving you. I think there's this idea that like, you know, everyone knows better than me, or everyone's doing better than me, or, oh, the academic community knows best because they're the most qualified or whatever. But just because somebody is further along in the journey than you or is more qualified than you, it doesn't mean that they know what is best for you and your research. Like every single piece of research is different, right? And so unique. And it's really to get super, super clear on what you want, what you are being led to do by your own instincts and your own gut, getting super clear on your own goals and leaning into what feels most right and what feels like it will best serve you to meet those goals. So this is really about listening to yourself and having trust and faith in your own sort of like inner voice, I guess, higher self. I know that's getting a little bit woo and a little bit spiritual.
Oh, I love the woo. Bring the woo on. Bring it on.
I think there's a lot of this, again, like you've talked about fear a lot, this fear of like, oh, we're not doing it right and we need to follow the rules. And there's a lot of like how to do something kind of edicts, I guess, out there in the academic world. But, you know, how to do something right for one person is not going to work for somebody else. And it's really kind of learning to trust that you do know what is going to be best for you and your project.
Yes, and yes.
And block out all that noise. Like this is about also giving yourself permission to block out noise that is not supporting or serving you.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Jamie, for reminding us how important intuition is. Thank you also for just encouraging us to face the mess and be in the mess.
Yes, get messy. Let yourself get messy.
Love it. So we're going to have people want to find out more about what you do. We'll have all the information in the show notes, so you can click through and find Jamie there. But first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time today to be here.
And thank you so much for having me. I love talking about mess. So thank you for giving me this half an hour to talk about all of that.
No worries. And thank you all for listening.